Good morning. My name is Bernard Conlon. This is the morning programme on Destination Uri, the local angle on Europe. And I'm joined in the studio this morning by Pamela Arthurs from East Border Region, an organisation based in Uri. Welcome to the programme, Pamela.
Thank you very much.
Can you tell me something about East Border Region? What is it, who is it, and what do you do?
Well, East Border Region has been in existence for almost 40 years now. It was formed initially in 1976 by local authorities, and indeed it remains today a local authority-led organisation. And in a nutshell, what really happened was you had politicians in Louth County Council whose jurisdiction bordered with politicians in Uri and Mourne District Council, and they realised that the two never really met. They didn't know each other. In the current climate in the 70s, it was back-to-back development along the border, and they thought it was worth starting to meet each other and to look at sort of common areas of interest.
That's an interesting point, because we tend to think of cross-border cooperation and all those good things as comparatively recent development. We tend to associate buzzwords like cross-border cooperation almost as part of the language of the peace process and the post-Good Friday Agreement. So you're telling me this is something from the 1970s. That's very interesting in itself, but it's essentially local authorities and local government.
And it's essentially local politicians who, despite what was happening at the national level, they realised that it would be pragmatic to actually meet with counterparts across the border and to look at areas of common interest. And we weren't unique in that, because in the northwest you had the councils there in 1975. They started to look at this, so they have a grouping there established in 75. But basically what happened was that the four councils, as it turned out then, Down District Council became involved, as did Monaghan County Council. So those four councils met, and areas of common interest were particularly around economic development, around agriculture, as it was at that time, around tourism. So they saw merit in actually working together. But the problem, and you've alluded to it there, was that cross-border cooperation wasn't fashionable. So throughout the 70s and indeed the 80s, the organisation, the members, had a lot of ideas, they had a lot of plans of activities that could happen, that could benefit the area, but there was no money and there was no will either in Dublin or in Belfast to pursue the work.
I think you're opening up a very interesting area of discussion, because local authorities, local government, I mean, they're democratically, they have a democratic mandate. They're accountable, they're very close to the ground, so they're accountable to their constituency.
Yes.
But in terms of this island, which is a relatively small island, to know that there has been that contact and that synergy between local councils and local authorities, north and south, for such a long period is heartening. And given the current climate of political difficulty that we're experiencing, it's good to know there's a solid foundation at the local authority level that has a legacy and a heritage.
Yes, and also I think what people need to remember is that our society was very different then. We were still in the midst of the Troubles. And we would have a number of high-level members who went on after East Border Region, for example, to become ministers and MPs, etc. But I remember having a conversation with Dermot Ahern, who's a former minister in the Irish government, and he was a member of East Border Region in the 80s, and basically he said it was daunting for them in the 80s to travel to meetings of East Border Region in Downpatrick. They were regularly stopped at army checkpoints. Our whole society was different then.
Of course it was.
But the big issue, it wasn't so much members travelling over the border south. It was the opposite, with them coming over.
Yes.
But indeed, in those early years, we had a tag, I suppose, of being a nationalist organisation. Because our two member councils were predominantly nationalist.
Right.
But throughout the 90s, we addressed that issue. Again, the political climate at a national level was changing. And currently, we have 10 member councils,
Right.
7 in Northern Ireland, and we would be predominantly unionist now
Okay,
on
that's-
Northern Ireland.
Well, that's
Yes,
That's
because the
interesting.
councils again realised that there was a benefit in
Right.
terms of becoming involved in this partnership.
so. Basically, you've evolved. You have, as you say, the balance of membership councils has tipped towards the northern side somewhat.
Well, it's tipped in on the northern side. We've 7 local authorities. We've 3 county councils in the
Right.
Republic. So in the northern side, I suppose if you looked at the makeup, we would have tipped towards the unionist.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. It's also particularly interesting given that we're on basically the eve of the emergence of the super councils in Northern Ireland. Whatever that is going to entail, but it's going to probably represent enhancement of local authority or local government remit in the north. So you probably are primed for that emergence.
Well, yes, and indeed it will be beneficial from my perspective because the district councils here in Northern Ireland have been typically small. There hasn't been a lot of synergies
Right.
actually council to council because the responsibilities have been so different north and south. So basically what's happening within the East Border region is that 7 local authorities in Northern Ireland become 3.
Yes.
So geography hasn't changed.
Yes.
But we've 3 larger councils
Right.
with enhanced powers
Right.
and responsibility.
Okay.
And they're actually matching the county councils better.
Right.
And they will do.
So
than-
to some extent, there's an element of political rationalisation going on, consolidation, if you wish, but also because the power sharing executive is going through, let's say, a doldrum at the moment. There still is this interesting context of local authority and local government
Cooperation.
Cooperation.
It's always been there.
Yes.
And I mean, that's probably something that isn't widely known.
Uh-huh.
But at that local practical level, and I feel that the success of East Border region has been because we have focused on economic development, which benefits the people of the region.
Yes.
And that's something that all of the politicians could buy into and all of the politicians were happy with.
Yes.
So it has worked extremely well from that perspective.
Pamela, it's fascinating what you're saying, and of course, we're better to centre a body like this, but in a town like Newry, which has evolved from being a town to become a city, and a city that now seems to be leaving its past of kind of being a jobs black spot into being
Yeah.
quite a centre of enterprise and innovation.
Yeah.
So Newry actually acts as a very good base for the organisation.
It does. But I suppose from my perspective, I would say Newry Dundalk as being the hub of the
Right.
region.
Right.
And what we believe in East Border is that if our hub, if our centre is doing well, that will benefit
Right.
everybody, because it's important in a partnership that everybody feels that they're getting something out
Right,
of it. You're
right.
not going to be involved in something if you're not seeing the added value.
Right.
So we're around balanced, sustainable development of the
Right.
region.
Right.
Now you'll have some developments, for example, inward investment perhaps in Dundalk or in Newry, and that will lift the whole region. That's
Okay.
what we believe. So,
Okay.
but at the same time, what we need to do is to develop programs of activity which will benefit Bangor,
Yes.
which will benefit Meath
Right.
as well.
Well, you just mentioned Bangor and Meath, and I've been reading some of your material on your website. There's mention about Christian heritage. I mean, we're more important than Bangor in terms of Irish Christian heritage. and of course places like
Armagh
Meath. Yes,
and Meath,
yes,
yes, absolutely.
you know, so
But again, I suppose how we developed, I mean, it's a parallel approach
Yes.
perhaps in East Border. Our politicians are very important, and the mix of politicians we have, all of the political parties in Northern Ireland represented, and in Southern Ireland as well. And it's important that they give us the go ahead as such,
of course,
the mandate to do the
Of
work
course.
that we do as officials.
yeah,
So what our aim has been, it's been about cross-border economic development, and our obvious fund for that has been the European Union Interreg Fund.
I wanted to come on to the European aspect because I'll be very honest. When I'm based in Uri here very recently, and I'm from Belfast and come down on a daily basis from Belfast. So for me, I'm still finding out about different organisations and networks in this part of the world. When I first heard of your organisation, my assumption was that it was some kind of quasi-European project. And so now I'm actually getting a clearer picture. I guess because there are so many organisations and structures, and
Absolutely, yes.
one does get a bit confused. But this is clearly one rooted in, in, as you say, it has a long heritage and it's in local government. So can you explain a little bit about your role in terms of Europe? You act as a sort of like an
Yes.
agency or a
Well,
conduit for European
Initially,
programmes?
we started as bringing the local authorities together, bringing the politicians together, and as importantly, the officials and councils. So initially, that was where we went. We weren't getting very far there. There was no money apart from what the local authorities themselves contributed. So the big opportunity came with the first Interreg programme, and now we're almost approaching the 5th of the 7-year cycle. So we took that.
Can you explain exactly what Interreg is?
Interreg, well, and again, I think it's important to distinguish it from the Peace Programme here, although they both have the same managing authority. The Interreg programme is a EU-wide programme. It used to be a community initiative. It's mainstreamed into European policy, and basically it's about tackling the particular problems that are apparent across border regions across Europe. So the Interreg programme that we have here, although it's distinct to Ireland, Northern Ireland, you'll probably find it's fairly similar to other border regions, to their programmes. The one advantage that we actually have here is that we all speak the same language. Some of the border regions can have up to 4 or 5 different languages. So obviously in the days when we used to print brochures, that was problematic because you needed something in 5 different languages, whatever. So the Interreg programme, it was a recognition by the Commission that they needed to tackle their border areas, that the border areas had these common problems. So we grasped that, and we applied for funding in the first programme. And in that programme, we actually, one of the key outputs, and you must remember we're back in the 80s, early 90s, was a brochure in 3 different languages. You know, which was a cross-border brochure, but also I think it was French and German as well. Then in the second programme, we applied again. We got more money. I think it was that time that I was appointed then. Basically, it was officials from councils that really took this on board as part of their everyday work. So they decided to dedicate staff to drive it forward. And then in the last Interreg programme, we actually were an implementing body, which meant we were awarded a significant amount of money.
When you say implementing body, what exactly do you mean? Because I know
means
that's
when you had an Interreg 3 programme of £180 million between...
It's a bit like being an agent, isn't it?
It is.
Yes.
So we actually were told you can spend, it was 53.9 million out of that programme on programmes which are under various themes.
Right.
So that programme was very successful, and it enabled us to do a series of valuable programmes which had a significant impact.
So Interreg, and I know Interreg is tied in with the structural funds and the likes of the European Regional Development, European Regional Development Fund. Pamela, I think one of the things that I think for a lot of people, the European process and the structures become a little bit they're a little bit of a mystery,
Yes,
and there's a lot of complexity, and there's this partnership, and there's this, the Special European support body, and there's all these names of different programs and projects. It kind of goes over people's heads a little bit.
Does indeed.
Do you think that is an issue or a problem for people, and maybe some of the people that you deal with in the course of your work?
I think that it's easier if you take the two main funds here, PEACE and Interreg, although there's significant millions of additional EU money that comes in. But if you look at those two who are managed by the Special EU Programmes body, PEACE, the man on the street can identify with. Interreg, no. They're not, it's just more difficult, they don't see. But when we are, when we funded programmes and activity is happening in small communities across the region, people begin to understand. Now, we've still a long way to go, but they begin to understand. So I think it's vital that these programmes make an impact, that we can provide support for infrastructure, even if it's small scale infrastructure, that people can visibly see, yes, that's what EU money is doing. Training programmes, and I'm not denigrating them, but the softer programmes, they come and they go. But programmes which have, some kind of infrastructure leaves a legacy, albeit small.
I'm going to be very honest, Pamela, by learning from you today that East Border region is rooted in local government, it makes it a bit easier for me to relate to. And I'm somebody who knows all about Europe, and I've lived in Brussels and I've worked with European concepts for a long time. But the fact that it's rooted in the local authority culture makes it a little bit more accessible even to to somebody like myself.
Yes.
But you're an agency for cross-border cooperation, you're a local authority, but you have this European role. You're actually a facilitator for European delivery on the ground. You help to deliver European money on the ground, so you're actually acting as a form of an agent for European.
Well, basically what we do is we will work with the local authorities, and what we find has been successful is on a thematic basis. So we'll sit with economic development officers across all our councils, or with tourism officers, or biodiversity officers, energy officers, and we look at the programme priorities and at ideas and needs that are coming through from our councils. And from that, the programmes, the projects develop. We assist the councils then to make the application. But the work, when the projects are approved, the work is done and implemented by the councils. Our role then is to make sure, and you've touched on it there, the complexity of the management of EU funding. It's horrendous, and it's never going to change. So they might talk about simplification, it might simplify a little bit, but it's still horrendous. So that's again our role, that we ensure that all of the rules and regulations are adhered to, that the councils draw down all of the money that they've been allocated. And that's important, because without that, again, the rules around maybe publicity, you don't follow the proper publicity, you don't follow the proper procurement. We ensure that the councils do that, and therefore there's no ineligible spend.
Okay.
And in this day and age, believe you me, that councils are finding the going tough, and they can't afford to lose money.
As everybody. I think we're going through a period where the whole process throughout Europe is being looked at, because the relationship between the citizen and Europe, and this is one of the things we've touched on in the local angle in Europe on this programme, how the ordinary citizen can relate to Europe and it be real. So for people in Uriu Mourne to know that there is an organisation that's rooted in its own local democracy is actually, I think, an important thing to know. Now, I've had some contact with some local projects here. I've had people from some projects that I know that East Border region supports.
We lead on them.
And the two of them are Smart Eco Hub, which is headquartered down in Dundalk in the Louth County Council, as far as I know. And the geotourism project, which is up based in Urian Mourne Council, which is a tourist project to promote Cooley, Mourne and Gullion. And Smart Eco Hub is basically sustainable energy, particularly for the business community. Can you say a little bit about those two projects as projects that again operate in this broad this area, Urian Mourne?
I suppose, Bernard, if I could put them into context, though, we identified a number of years ago that it's a small business. Now, when we say small business, we're particularly talking about micro enterprises with 10 or less employees. In this region, we have 26,500 of those. So we saw, and particularly in a recession, there's a need to support businesses. So we have 6 programs which support businesses, and Smart Eco is one of those. And it's around the clustering of companies in the energy sector. But we've also got, and this morning we had an important event in the IOTA programme, another one that we support.
What is the IOTA programme?
It's around innovation and promoting innovation within these small businesses. And it has a target, I think, of 650 small businesses, and it's well on its way to working with 650 businesses across the region, and it will finish in June. And indeed, that's the problem with EU funding. You know, these projects are dependent on it, and there's only a certain life cycle. And cross-border cooperation isn't easy. So the idea would be that at the end of the 3-year cycle, these programs would be sustainable. That's generally not the case. And what happens is you've built up this relationship, you've worked with the businesses across the region, and then the funding goes, staff go, and you've lost the momentum a wee bit. But that's just the nature of EU funding. So there's 6 there. I'll not go into detail on them, but on our website you'll find those. But also tourism. We've 2 major tourism projects. The geotourism you've talked about, the lead council in that is Urian Mourne District Council. And as I said before, staff implement these projects. We don't. We just make sure they're managed according to the rules. And the other big one is the tourism development plan. And again, because we need to address the particular areas across our region, we have Christian heritage as an important part of that. We've also got countryside tourism, and we've got visitor servicing.
Right.
So we can, for example, we can, within that programme, we can fund activities which are coastal, but we can also fund you know, lakes and waterways which are inland. So that covers our region, and there's impact then across the region.
Pamela, it seems to me that there's just a massive amount going on. There's a huge amount of projects going on in tourism, in enterprise, in environment, in culture, and business, and energy sustainability. We've mentioned Smart Eco Hub. And you're obviously an organisation that's been on the ground for a long time, and as I say, you're linked into the community because you're this relationship with local authorities. Is there a job for you to proclaim yourself a little bit more, to let the public out there know a little bit more about your existence, and to say, well, here we are?
Well, perhaps there is, but I suppose our key stakeholders have been the local authorities. So when we are working closely, and the local authorities will contribute costs towards the running of the organisation, what we find is that our job is done when we draw the money down there. That's success for us. And the local authorities will implement, they'll do the work on the ground. Like, for example, last Friday, the Kilbrony event space was launched. Now, that's the local authorities' launch, but it's one element of our tourism project. So you find that, you know, we're basically the cross-border element of the council, but the council will, you know, have its own law. And that's just the way, as part of, you know, council organisations, that's the way we work. In terms of, I suppose, our interface with the community, we're probably removed a bit because it's about...
You're quite a small organisation,
Oh,
aren't
we
you?
are.
And you're based in Uri, and you've got your secretariat in Uri?
Yes, we've got our, and we are small, but again, we use very effectively our linkages with our local authorities and with our
Okay.
staff there.
Okay.
And we've a wide network. We work closely again with the other stakeholders in the region, such
Okay.
as the enterprise agencies, enterprise
Okay.
boards, the colleges, Southern Regional College,
Right.
Southeastern, Dundalk
Okay.
Institute. Really, we would work, but at that level, we don't work on a day-to-day basis, and we don't fund, community type projects.
Yes.
That's for the PACE program.
Of course, of course.
Interreg's about cross-border
Right.
economic development.
Yes, okay. No, from talking to you, Pamela, I've got a little insight that I didn't have before. It's important to know, and as I said, because of the emergence of the Super Council era, which I think begins in March,
1st of April.
1st of April, we're entering into a relatively new era for local councils and local authorities on this side of the border.
Yes.
So your role is probably going to be more important under that, in that
Well,
context?
hopefully,
Yes?
hopefully, but this is a period of
Okay.
immense change right
Yes.
across the board. Our southern councils are starting to get their head out of the water, in terms of the austerity. The austerity is very much heading
course.
in Northern Ireland, and with the RPA and the merging of councils, you can see that money is a big issue. Link that with the end of one structural fund period and the beginning of
Right.
another, when there's always that period in between before new monies start to flow. And that's a difficult and challenging time for any organisation. Although we're local authority led, we're a company. All our directors are councillors. So we need to survive.
And
in
you're
the
exclusively
meantime.
based in Uri. Your
We're
office
based
and all
in-
your staff are in
We're
Uri.
based in Uri, but we're very much a regional
Okay.
organisation.
And you've like one office basically with
We've one office.
Yeah. And how many staff do you have?
We have 9,
Okay.
there's 9 including myself
Okay.
at the minute.
So
But again, as projects and programmes finish, we lose staff, unfortunately.
Of course.
But as new programmes come on board, we'll hopefully
Okay.
build that up again. But no, it's a challenging time, and indeed for any sort of organisations out there working with councils in Northern Ireland at the minute, it's difficult and it's challenging.
Pamela, it's been really interesting talking to you because I feel as if I've got an insight into something that I wasn't aware of before. I know there is a web of organisations, but knowing that there certainly is an organisation that's linked to the democratic process is heartening.
Yes. Well, I suppose the one thing I would say is that we're the only cross-border organisation. You've got some organisations which are either northern or southern, and they work across the border.
Yes.
But we're the only
And you're
genuinely.
and you're one with a serious heritage. I mean, you're going
Yes.
back to 1976,
Yes,
as we said before.
absolutely.
So that's
Absolutely.
noteworthy in itself.
Yes.
Pamela, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming in.
It's lovely
Yes.
to meet you.
Thank you, thank you. Well, that's the morning programme. Bernard Conlon with Pamela Arthurs. Thank you very much for watching.